all aspects and change a lot of the structure and the environment in our intelligence agency. We've been talking about that. I want to talk about just 1 second. I believe it was not a success yesterday for our intelligence agencies. If it was not a success, it was a failure. Now, I'm not here to put blame on anybody, because there have been many successes, but we have to start with where we are. We had a terrible situation yesterday. We will have it again unless we eradicate terrorism. We got to do it. We can do it, but only with resolve.
Okay, I want to thank all three of you, Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, Senator Shelby. Thanks for your insight on these remarkable hours as they go by. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And updating once again the latest developments at this hour. A 54-story building across the street from New York's World Trade Center has partially collapsed. Rescue crews working in the ruins of the Twin Towers were evacuated before the building at One Liberty Plaza began to fall. 9 people have been pulled alive from the rubble of yesterday's attack. While some workers were back on the job at the Pentagon today, fire and rescue crews are finding it tough to make much headway in still smoldering ruins. One way the country is reacting to the devastation and horrific casualties is through prayer. There was a gathering in Dallas today, and a vigil has been underway at the U.S. Capitol. The investigation into the attacks has led authorities to several parts of the United States. Boston, where 2 of the hijacked planes originated, has been a focus of their efforts. A number of people have been detained for questioning. Greta?
Well, for some more insight into the massive task investigators are facing, we're joined by Bill Hinshaw at CNN Center in Atlanta. He's a former special agent with the FBI and a veteran of many bombing and hijacking investigations. And from New York, former City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. Welcome to both of you. Bill, first to you. How do you get knives and box cutters on airplanes? In fact, on 4 different airplanes within about an hour and a half.
Well, I think it was pretty well planned, and it's relatively easy, or was relatively easy, because I think the focus of the interdiction was against weapons and explosives and not against knives or screwdrivers or box cutters.
But you know, Bill, you still got to get through security, and every time I go through security, I go through, my body goes through the metal detector and my carry-on baggage goes through the machine. Isn't anybody looking?
I've gotten on the plane with Swiss Army knives. I've got on the last flight I was on was behind a guy that had a toolbox that had a number of fancy looking tools, but among them was a box cutter and several long screwdrivers. So I think the whole focus was not on what the hijackers used.
Ray, do you think the questions, have you packed your own bags and have your luggage been with you since you packed them? Are those questions simply of no value?
Yeah, I think they're of no value. I think they're silly. If you remember when we first started these magnetometers and checking people in, we used law enforcement personnel to do that. We've gotten away from that for a long time. We now use people who try hard, but certainly the standards are not very high. There's tremendous turnover. That's something that I believe has to change right now in the near term. It's just it's a silly exercise.
It was a pleasure. Ray, what do you make of the fact that they were able to get knives and box cutters? I mean, it wasn't simply one slip, one person. I mean, this was a plan. 4 different flights had them.
Undoubtedly, it was a plan, and I'm sure it was practiced. It was something that they just didn't do for the first time. You know, if you look at the FAA tests that they do at virtually every major airport each year, some of the failure rates are as high as 80%. So it's an area that needs to be looked at and needs to be changed radically. It's drifted so much since the 70s when we first started these types of security checks.
You know, Bill, when I hear him say 80% failure, that apparently we've known there's an 80% failure in the security on these questions and getting weapons onto planes, I must admit I'm scandalized. I mean, is this what's been happening in our airports?
I suppose it has. That's what the tests show. But until we had an event such as this, it didn't really come to become a national event.
Ray, obviously the pilots of these planes have gone down, but there are a lot of people that may have helped these pilots commit this horrible crime. How do we find the others, the ones who may have helped a little bit and therefore are co-conspirators and just as responsible?
Well, you do the classic backtracking investigation, just what the FBI is doing now. You're checking rental car records, you're checking itinerary. I mean, we've seen it. We saw it in 1999 with Ahmad Rassam. We know that Canada is clearly an easy point of entry for people to come from places like the Middle East, get into Canada, and then come across our border. Last year, we had almost 500 million visitors into the United States. We need a much stronger border protection. We tried to get that in Congress after Ahmad Rassam came across in the millennium in 1999, and there was, quite frankly, no response. We need a much more robust examination of people coming into the United States. It hasn't changed, certainly in the last 2 years, and that was Rassam came in with 150 pounds of explosive and was headed for LAX. He was convicted. He also, by the way, pointed towards Osama bin Laden. So, I mean, more and more evidence is being accumulated that points to bin Laden as our major enemy in this area.
Bill, how easy to get into these cockpits?
Well, the last plane I was on, the cockpit door was open a good bit of the time. In the days a quarter of a century ago when we were facing the hijackings, or people were hijacking for money, they closed the cockpit door, and usually there was an armed sky marshal behind there, and nobody went in there, not even flight attendants. So,
but today, I mean, but obviously Ford did get in. Do you think it's extortion that they threaten the pilots are going to slit someone's throat or do something like that to get the pilots to open the doors?
I think they possibly could have, because my understanding is that the assumptions have always been don't do anything to make the hijackers mad. Let's get them on the ground. We'll negotiate with them, give them pizzas for passengers, and do something like that. These people obviously had an entirely different intent, and they didn't fit the profile, and we paid for it.
Ray, I've heard so often everyone say these are trained pilots, experienced pilots, and I do understand there's some reports saying that they had trained in Florida. But to fly a 757 or a 767, at least I would think, takes a significant amount of training, does it not?
Well, you know, these aircraft these days are fly-by-wire. They're computer controlled. You can get even simulator programs for computers. I think once it's up in the air, it's probably not that challenging, particularly if you've had some flight training. So I think it's probably easier than you might suspect.
What about aiming, though? They still wanted to hit targets. 3 of the planes were headed for targets.
Right, and I think obviously they had some training in that regard. But I mean, you talk to pilots, they say that it isn't that complicated. There is a lot of this, of course, is on automatic pilot. You get from one location to the other by going from point to point. You disengage that automatic pilot, then you do the aiming. Yes, it takes some training, but I'm told it doesn't take that much to be able to steer the aircraft.
All right, Bill Henshaw, Ray Kelly, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
The effort to identify the hijackers has led investigators to Florida, where they are questioning people and executing search warrants. CNN's Susan Candiotti is in Vero Beach, Florida, with that part of the story. Susan?
Hello, Greta. Indeed, the FBI here in Florida had a very, very busy day indeed. We'll try to give you the highlights of what happened here this day and in other locations as well. First, we can report to you that the FBI indeed has leads on suspected hijackers that were involved in this terrorist attack. They are still hijackers who attended flight schools here in Florida. And at this hour, the FBI continues to look at other flight schools here in Florida. Law enforcement sources say that 2 of the suspected hijackers, at least 2 of them, lived here in Vero Beach. 2 of them are brothers that lived here. One of them lived on this very street. Both are described as Saudi citizens. One of them is Adnan Bukhari. Adnan Bukhari, we have a photograph of him. He is said to be in his 40s. He is described as a commercial pilot for Saudi Arabian Airlines. Also living in Vero Beach, Bukhari's brother Amir. Both lived here with their wives and children. Now, this afternoon, we also had a chance to go inside one of their rented homes. This is the one rented by Adnan Bukhari. It was searched this day by the FBI, and according to documents left behind by agents, they seized a number of items, including a computer software, U.S. immigration papers, bank receipts, phone cards, a flight safety bag. We also saw a pilot's certificate, as well as a certificate that they had received specialized instruction on multi-engine planes. These pilots, we are told by law enforcement sources, attended Flight Safety International, a flight school here in Vero Beach. Law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the Bukhari brothers were believed to have been on one of the 2 flights out of Boston one of those two flights that wound up slamming into the World Trade Center. Also, we can report to you that a car impounded in Portland, Maine, according to law enforcement authorities, was rented at Boston Logan Airport and driven to Portland, Maine. Now, the Maine State Police confirmed that two of the suspected hijackers were on a U.S. air flight out of Logan Airport, again, one of the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. The FBI also looking at two more suspected hijackers who spent some time both in Venice, Florida, as well as Coral Springs, Florida, which is located in the south. The two are Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef al-Shahi. Now, they stayed for a few days at the home of Charlie Voss in Venice, Florida, and they took courses at Hoffman Aviation. These people both had passports from the United Arab Republic. And finally, we can tell you that at this hour at FBI headquarters in Miami, the FBI is interviewing someone they described as a witness or friend or associate of the suspected hijackers. Back to you, Greta.
Susan Candiati, thank you very much. Wolf, back to you.
Thank you very much, Greta. And the investigation is also moving forward on the international front tonight. CNN's Mike Boettcher is tracking those developments. He joins us now from the CNN Center in Atlanta. What kind of leads, Mike, are you hearing about that point to Osama bin Laden?
Well, what they're doing is going back 2 years and going over all of the analysis they've had in this transformation of Al-Qaeda, which is the network run by Osama bin Laden. There are intercepts, and that has been talked about by officials in the government, SIGINT, as it's called, Signals Intelligence. But they're also going back with clues back for the last 2 years as Al-Qaeda has tried to transform itself, Wolf, trying to bring in various groups from other countries, especially from North Africa. They're taking a close look at Algerians as well, because it was an Algerian terrorist group, GIA, which tried to also perform a similar terrorist incident, ramming a hijacked airliner into the Eiffel Tower. That was unsuccessful, of course. That happened back in the mid-90s. It was thwarted. So they're casting their broad net, looking at what the information was over the past 2 years, Wolf, and they have gleaned a lot of evidence from that period.
And I know, Mike, you have a sort of a handbook that the Osama bin Laden organization, Al-Qaeda, circulated, which was intercepted. Tell us about some of the tips they have in there.
Well, this was introduced in the trial of the bombers of the African embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. It is an Al-Qaeda operations manual, and it dissects precisely small things. For example, what Susan was talking about on the air just a few moments ago, how to rent an apartment. Let me give you an example. In one section called Security Precautions Related to Apartments, it reads, providing the necessary cover for people who frequent the apartment, avoid seclusion and isolation from the population, and refraining from going to the apartment at suspicious times. And it is preferable to rent these apartments using false names, appropriate cover, and non-Muslim appearance. Now, if these suspected terrorists are part of Al-Qaeda, certainly this manual would have been part of the game plan, so to speak, Wolf, they would have followed.
Mike Boettcher, thank you very much. And let's get some historic perspective now on this tumultuous day and a half, the attack on America. How are we coping? What's likely ahead? Let's check in with CNN senior analyst Jeff Greenfield. He's in New York. Jeff, I was moved yesterday, Jeff, when you spoke about fear in America and how all of us probably will change our definition of that word as a result of what has happened.
I think that's right, Wolf. We have been a country blessed by two oceans, blessed by, except for the Civil War, never really having had violence on our soil, with the rare exception of Oklahoma City. I think if you were around New York today, it felt different than any other time I can remember. I took the subway down to work, as I always do. People were not just quiet, they were numb. Spoke to one of my old friends today who's a frequent world traveler, not going to Europe on his next planned trip, really uneasy about getting on an airplane. And that, I think, is the most significant question we face, whether this event really does, for a long period of time, fundamentally shake the security that we as Americans have always felt in our own country.
And there's no doubt even much more mundane matters will be rethought. For example,